Hello quilters, it's Jane and we're back in the sewing room. Today we're going to talk about the half square triangles that will be used to finish out the piecing of our Cozy Christmas blocks. As you see examining the block here, there are 12 half square triangles used with black squares in the center along the top and the bottom. There are 6 green and black half square triangles and 6 red and black half square triangles. You are going to be using triangle papers to create your half square triangles, and this is the Primitive Gatherings 2.5 inch finished half square triangle sheets. This is what we're going to be using for our project. In your first kit, you received an assortment of 12 different red fabrics and 12 different green fabrics, and in the cutting instructions it was recommended that you pick 6 of each of those, and we will use those in our first round of half square triangle creating today. So I'd just like to take a moment to review those cutting instructions. You may have already done your cutting. If you have, that's fine. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page and has things cut correctly. All right, so I have chosen 6 of my red print fabrics and 6 of the green prints, and these pieces are all approximately 9 inches by 14 inches. And the cutting instructions indicate that you're going to cut these in half lengthwise to yield 2 pieces 4.5 by approximately 14. That's going to vary just a little bit depending on what the width of the fabric was to begin with as we cut your kits. So I have now 2 pieces of this green. I'm going to set one of those aside. I may use it later. So here's my first green piece. I'm going to do that very same thing with each of the greens and with the red fabrics that I chose as well. Now, also in your kit, you received 2 pieces of black fabric. One of those pieces is 12 inches by the full width of the fabric, as you see here. From that piece, your instructions indicated that you were to trim the selvage and then to cut 1, 2, 3 11-inch segments. That's going to leave you a leftover piece of fabric at the end of this. You're going to set that piece aside, but you're going to have 3 segments of fabric that are 11 inches by 12 inches. I'm going to go ahead and cut 1 segment here so that I can show you the next step in the cutting process. So now I have an 11 by 12 inch piece. I'm going to subcut that into 3 pieces. So this is the 12-inch dimension. I'm going to cut 3 4-inch pieces from this. So from each of these 12 by 11-inch segments, I have created 3 4 by 11-inch pieces. So I'm going to do that for each of those 11-inch segments that I cut from that width of fabric piece. Then I'm going to take the second piece of black fabric in the kit, which is, again, it's 12 inches in length, it's 22 inches in width. I'm going to cut an 11-inch segment from that and subcut it, again, just as I did the other segments. So now I'm going to have a total of 12 of these 4-inch by 11-inch segments. So I'm going to use these in making my half square triangles. So once you've got all your black pieces cut and your colored pieces cut, you're ready for the next step in the process. You're going to take the colored fabric strip, place it right side up on your cutting surface. Then I want you to take one of your black strips that you have cut, place it on top of the green. The idea here is that you're placing these right sides together. My fabric is now ready. My triangle papers from Primitive Gatherings are designed such that if I were using a quilt pattern that called for a large number of half square triangles out of one particular fabric combination, I could use a larger piece of fabric of my two fabrics and I could make 24 half square triangles that are identical at one time. For our quilt, we don't need that many identical half square triangles. We actually only need 6 half square triangles from each fabric. So with your triangle paper, you're going to cut off the excess along the top dotted line and the bottom dotted line just to get rid of that excess portion of the paper. Then if you examine the important part of the paper, you will see that there are solid lines. Those are cutting lines. So there's solid lines in the grid formation, and there's a solid line diagonally across the center of each of these squares. Those are all cutting lines. The dotted lines are going to be your stitching lines. So to begin, I would like you to cut this into segments of 3 squares. So you will have 1, 2, 3, 4 segments of 3 squares each that will look like this. This is what I'm going to use to make my 6 half square triangles out of each of my fabrics. So I have subcut across. You want to be accurate. You want to cut right on that cutting line so that you have an accurate strip to utilize for your triangles. So I'm now going to take this and I'm going to place it on top of the black fabric. So now I have green fabric, black fabric with my paper on top. I'm going to put a couple of pins in place just to hold this so that it will not move around when I try to stitch it. I found it actually helpful at this point. Here's my strip that I have already pinned. I found it helpful to actually mark where I am going to be sewing. So it doesn't matter where you start. There may be some writing on your papers that may say start or end. Disregard that because that is written as if you were using that entire sheet all at once, and you're not doing that. So start at one end or the other, doesn't really matter which, and start along one of the dotted lines, one of the sewing lines. So I'm going to hold this so that you can see it a little better. I've taken my friction pen and I've actually made a line here along that stitching line. When I get to this point right here, I'm going to pivot right on that cutting line. I'm going to pivot, follow the line. I'm going to stitch off the fabric here. You see I've actually used a chalk marker and drawn the extension of that line onto the black fabric here. Going to then pivot, turn, and stitch back onto the paper, following this stitching line, off the fabric at the other end, pivot, pivot again, and come back. Now I'm on my second stitching line here. I will follow it until I get to the cutting line here. I will pivot exactly on the line and follow that in the next segment, off the paper onto the fabric, pivot one more time and head back along this line and off the fabric adjacent to my starting point. So I've made one continuous stitching line. And if you use some sort of colored marker that actually shows you specifically where you want to sew, at least on the first one or two of these until you get the idea, I think you may find that helpful. When you go to your sewing machine to stitch this, we recommend that you use a size 70 microtex needle, so a small, sharp needle. And we recommend that you set your stitch length on 1.5, so a very short stitch length. What that will do for you is it will perforate the paper along that stitching line and make it easier to tear your paper away later on. So once you have done that, and you have the complete stitching line finished here, you are then going to trim your triangles. So first of all, you will trim all the way around the outside, making sure that you're on the cutting lines. So you can cut the ends off on the solid cutting lines, and then at this point I would have my pins out of the way. Lay your ruler along the edge, along the cutting line where you have trimmed your paper, and trim your triangles. Try to trim them as accurately as you can. So once you have the long strip trimmed down, then you are ready to cut the triangles apart. First, you will subcut them into squares. So you will have individual squares, as you see here. Then you will make the final cut down the center, which will yield 2 triangles, as you see here. Now, at that point, you are ready to do your pressing. You see that I have my triangle here on the back. I can see my black fabric with the stitching line clearly visible on there. I'm going to grab my wool pressing mat, and I'm going to show you how to press this. First of all, I'm just going to press to set my stitches. So I'm going to press one side and the other side. Now I'm going to open my triangle up. You see that this is a red and black triangle here. I'm going to, with the paper still on, I'm going to press that seam allowance toward the black. Get this nice and flat. Press toward the black. Once you have done that, you're now ready to take the paper off. If you fold the paper along the stitching line, fold and create a crease along that stitching line, then it should be nicely perforated by your stitches. You can begin tearing the paper away in the center. Don't start at the ends, start in the center. Pull that paper away, use a little bit of fingernail action along the stitching line, and tear toward the corners. There's my big piece gone. The little piece, you just get a hold of it, it will come off very easily. So now I have my half square triangle. It just needs to be trimmed down. I need those dog ears trimmed off. Let me move my iron out of the way. And if you have a small square ruler, that would be the easiest way to do this. I seem to have misplaced my small square ruler. I want to trim this down to 3 inches. It's going to be 2.5 inches finished when all the seam allowances are off and it's sewn into my block, but at this point it needs to be 3 inches. So I'm going to lay my ruler on here. I'm going to line up the diagonal line on the ruler with the seam line in my half square triangle. I'm going to line up the edges, and I need to trim it just a tidge here because it's just ever so slightly larger, which is a good thing because that means I can end up with a very, very accurate half square triangle. I turn the triangle around. Again, I'm lining up my diagonal line on my ruler with the seam line and trimming my last two sides. And I now have a perfect half square triangle that measures 3 inches and will measure 2.5 inches when it's finished. So that's the process for creating your half square triangles that you will use in your Cozy Christmas blocks. So, quilters, I will tell you a little secret. You need 12 different half square triangles for this first block, 6 red and 6 green. So if you would like to, you can do all of your stitching. You can trim enough to get you the 12 half square triangles that you need, and you can do what I did, which is to leave the rest of them with the papers on in a little pile that you can, when you have a few minutes, come back and press and trim a few of these at a time so that you don't have to trim all of them at once. But you want to end up, for this number 1 block today, with 6 different reds and 6 different greens. And then you are ready to complete the piecing of your first block. Thank you, and I hope you found this video helpful.